Howdy folks! So today's lesson is going to be on explaining Blender curves a lot more and helping you understand how you can use them to model. So I'm just going to go through a few things about them that you should know. This is kind of an obscure thing right here, the circle types that I'm about to talk about, but I just want to mention it in case it matters. This could be something that would matter more in a production context, but just something to be aware of. So first of all, when I go over the curves, there's two different kinds, basically. We have the Bezier curve and the path. Um, this one, honestly, I never touch it, so I'm mostly just going to explain these two, and even then I'm mostly going to explain this one, because for reasons I will explain. So Bezier to start is pretty classic. I'm sure you can imagine what it would be, just regular handles. It's pretty standard. And then there's a path curve, which is controlled with like control points, and there's like a fall off smoothing happening between each of those points. So it's just, you obviously can't control the direction that the curve is facing with this, but it's a lot simpler in terms of controls, and honestly you can get very similar geometry shapes from them. So knowing the difference between those two curves, there is also the option when you create a curve to make a circle right away. So Bezier circle would look like this. Obviously just has the control points. And then if you're to make a NURB circle, still looks like a circle, but it's using these points. And these circles can be generated before, like as you're creating a sphere or like the curve, or you can remove it. Near the bottom here, active spline, there is order U, which is, I'll explain in a moment, but the cyclic setting is the one that will control whether or not this curve closes, which is the same for Bezier, whether or not it closes. So those are the two main types that I'm going to talk about. And the critical difference between path and Bezier is how they smooth. So the path curve gives you a slightly rounded or like shaved down corner edge, like it's not perfectly round, and it's very similar to if you were to create a mesh for a cube and subdivide it and then convert that into an object. It's very similar to the result this would give you. And if you use a Bezier curve, it will make a perfectly round circle. So if you're just using this for modeling, it may not necessarily matter, but if you're building something with animation that has like parts that intersect and they're round and they need to like connect perfectly, or if you're building something for 3D printing, this might be something that you just want to be aware of. That is an aspect. So just wanted to mention that. Okay, so in terms of when you create a curve, there's a few basic settings that matter. So first of all, to access the curves in the Properties panel, Curve menu, you have to have the curve selected. If you're on a piece of geometry or something, you won't have that menu. Again, context sensitive. And then it looks like a lot. There's quite a few settings here, but honestly, there's only a few that really, really matter. So in order to see geometry, there's two ways to do that under the geometry tab. So let's just collapse everything that I'm not talking about at this moment, so it's a little bit easier to look at. So if we look at the geometry tab, this is pretty much the area I tend to go to first when I'm building something. You can either extrude as a flat, just straight out, up and down, or you can extrude into a circle. So this will just give you depth. And then within that circle, you have a few other choices. So you have your fill mode if you want just the back half of it, or the front half, or half of it. Like if you want a half pipe, you could do something like that. That could potentially be useful, especially like if you need that curvature, but you don't need the whole thing. That could potentially be helpful. And you also have the option to fill caps if you want. So this resolution and this resolution preview U, those are the two settings that are going to control the resolution of the sphere itself, or the curve. So in order to see it, enabling wireframe is the easiest way. So the ones that will control the spans running down the tube, so how frequent these are, that's the resolution preview U. And you'll also notice if you go into the active spline, there's a resolution U. These are the same thing. It's just two different ways to affect the same thing. If I drop this one, or if I drop this one, it's just whichever panel you're in. I tend to just default to this one because it's at the top and it's usually the first thing I set, and I tend to just set straight to 3. Like 90% of the stuff I build a curve is like 3 is like a good resolution for things. 12 is generally way too high. And then the resolution that goes around your curve, that is the resolution here. So this number doesn't mean 4 edges. It's just like I don't know exactly, it's like an amount, but if you go to 0, you'll see 0 is actually 4. So 1 is 6, 2 is 8, etc. And then eventually you'll just probably memorize what this number correlates to in edges around. But for like, again, 90% of the stuff I'd be building, I usually go between 1, not keying, I don't want to key it, 1 and like 3, generally speaking. Most things are good at that amount. So that's typically what I'll go for. Okay, so that's how you add geometry and thickness. I'm also going to we'll talk about the shape next. So in terms of this fall off I was mentioning earlier, so it's quite smooth by default, which may not necessarily be what you want. So you'll need to navigate down to order U, and by default 5, I think 6 is the highest you can go, but 5 is generally its starting point. As you drop it, it will snap more to those points and the edges. So I just have an example here so this is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You can kind of see as it goes down. Now, as I'm going down in this number, you'll notice no matter how many times I click it, I can't get to 1, but I listed a 1 here. And that's because the way you get to 1 is you have to do it from geometry first. So you essentially have to break this smoothing mechanism in order to get it to be like perfectly sharp. So I'll explain how to do that. So a couple ways to get there. So convert mesh, you can turn it into an object. I could have also just created a new object. It doesn't really matter. Basically, all that's important is that I have an edge that was created from geometry first. So I'm going to break that off as a selection. So it's just a regular edge. And now I'm going to convert it back into a curve. And then when I add depth, you'll notice it's only around those specific points. So if you need it to be extremely sharp, that's how you would go about doing it. The one thing is, though, once you break it, you can't unbreak it. So if I needed to get this back, probably what I would do is just reduce the depth so it's easier to snap, grab my curve, and then just holding control to snap to those points. I would probably do something like that, and then you have your order U back. So that's the one thing, is it can only go in one direction. So that's how you control like the fall off of your curve. Now, in terms of the shape around, because round is the default shape that it'll give you, but it's not the only one that you have necessarily. It could be any number of things. So there's a few different ways to control it. By default, it goes to round, which is, again, just going to be purely round. You can also go to object. So the object in question needs to be a curve. So in this example here, I have it set to object. I have it set to this object specifically. So you can alter your shape. Sometimes it takes a little bit of work just to get these aligned. I might have had my orientations, hang on, Y, 180. It's very common when you create these shapes that they probably won't be perfectly lined up. It depends how you set it up. In terms of connecting things to modifiers like that will be a separate lesson, just because that's like another big thing to mention for like how Blender operates. But yeah, you definitely can do stuff like this. You can also, for example, so a lot of modifiers don't work on curves. A decent amount do, but a lot of them don't. Like the mirror, for example, doesn't work on curves. So if I want to use a mirror on this, but I can't because I can't create that modifier, I can convert it back into a mesh. It'll break my curve, but that's completely fine. I'm going to delete the edges that I want to create the mirror from. Make sure you delete the edges so they actually get deleted. Create that mirror. Do my whatever adjustments that I wanted to make with the mirrored mode on, and then convert it back into a curve. And because the name hasn't changed, the data is still connected. It was just the wrong object type, so it wasn't able to display. But now that it's a curve again, it can redisplay. So you are able to make those changes, go back and forth as many times as you need, and it doesn't really take issue with that. The other way to get a bevel, a custom bevel, is to do the profile bevel. So instead of object, go by profile, and then it gives you this like little graph screen, so you can just update it, and then it'll update your shot or your object. So this is really good if you're doing architecture, or if you're doing like trims of rooms, or like build it like the trim of a roof or something like that. It's definitely handy for those kinds of things because you can get that fully custom shape, and then this is still like a very bendable tube. And even this tube itself, right? Keep in mind that this is also a curve, which means modifiers can be applied to this as well, such as shrink wrap, or I don't know, whatever else you want. Probably just simple deform or shrink wrap is probably what you would want, but those are some options. And then you even have a choice Okay, yeah, so tapering. So that's okay, so far we've talked about, just to summarize a little bit here, we've talked about the roundness of the curve. We talked about how to change the fall off of the curve. We talked about how to get geometry on the curve and how to change the profile of that geometry. So there's one more aspect to curves, which is their like thickness, because how do you change, you know, their roundness from one side to another? Few different ways to do that. First option is to use a taper object. So in this case, I'm using this other curve as my taper object. So as I move this around, it can create a very precise shape. So if you need to make something that's like really flowy and really smooth, and you want it to stay live as a curve, because there are other ways to smooth stuff out as geometry, but if you want it to be a curve, then there's ways to like edit that so you can make that live. The second option is in this transform panel. You'll get these special options here that aren't usually present for anything else other than curves. So you've got the main two that you care about are radius and tilt. So radius is pretty self-explanatory. On this case, it doesn't work because it is connected to this piece. But if I pick one that's not connected, then I can change it this way. So you do have to pick one or the other. You can't use both together, but that is an option. Hotkey for that is Alt S, makes that very easy. And the nice thing about this too is they respond to the soft select. So if you want to create the fall off of multiple at the same time, it makes it, honestly, the use of soft select being so good with this curves, I never even use this taper thing, but it's an option if you want it. So that's a choice. And then the last thing is tilt, which is very self-explanatory. Will allow you to tilt your curve, and yeah, that's generally sometimes something you want. You can make some cool twisty patterns that way, and you can make them very custom, which is nice. And then on top of that, there are a few bonus options in terms of like controlling these points. So we've talked about the geometry and how to edit that geometry and change its form and stuff, but I haven't really mentioned these points specifically. So there is uh, a menu. If you right click, you'll say you'll see the curve context menu, and there's a few different choices here. So if you want to add a piece, you can say subdivide. It will kind of change your distribution a little bit, so just kind of be aware of that. If you want to smooth them out a little bit, you have that option. If it's like a little too, you're trying to make like a really big complex smooth shape, and like say you're just trying to make something that's like round and you're just yanking out the points, you can just kind of like roughly yank them into position and then grab the whole thing and then smooth it a little bit. You have another option if you want to duplicate a piece off. It's very easy. It's just the same hotkey as it would be for modeling. It's just Shift D to duplicate a piece. One thing to be aware of though, if you duplicate a piece, this order U, just watch it when you duplicate things. I've noticed if you duplicate a piece that's too tiny, sometimes it breaks. For example, if I split this off, yeah, so my option, if I go to this curve, I might have broken it. See, I don't see it anymore, but it's still here. So if it's right under path animation, and if I go here, I don't see it. So I've just broken that order U. So just normally what prevents that is if you duplicate like a whole curve or at least 3 points, then usually you can like maintain it, and that's not bad, but that's just something to watch for when you do duplicate points. You can also extrude them off. That's a pretty safe way to add distance without breaking the order U. Let's see what else we got here. If you want to change, so say for example, you've gotten you've messed up your thickness all the way around, and you actually didn't want to change a bunch of values. You just want to go back to the neutral value, and you know that for Blender, the hotkey for all is holding Alt. So if you're entering a value and you have multiple objects selected and you hold Alt, it will apply that value to all objects. Normally, that's the case, but in this one specific context, so if I hold Alt and I change mean radius back to 1, it's not doing it. It basically applies a value of 1 to each of these points individually, so it's kind of like offsetting the whole thing, which isn't really what you want. So you specifically how to go to set curve radius, say if I go back to 1, and then hit enter, and then it will basically like force, regardless of what value is on those points, to be back to 1. So that would be how you like re-neutralize your curve if you've messed with these settings too much and you want to take it back. Another option, say you like what you have, it's just like a little too extreme, you can smooth curve radius. It will make it, sometimes this is a little unpredictable. It kind of depends. You may need to adjust like your highest points, but basically what it's going to do is going to try to take basically smooth out that radius between the points that you've selected. You can do it with the whole thing. If you do the whole thing, yeah, see how it's brought it out more to this point. If I want it to not be like that, I probably need to just manually do this a little bit. It's a little, like I said, it's a little unpredictable. Like in this case, it shrank it quite a bit, but it seems to be taking between the 2 points that you selected, and it will potentially change it quite a lot, but it's handy. Those are the main ones that you would want to say. You can also, I know there's one for make a segment. So say for example, if I merged this around or something, and I wanted to combine these for some reason, or if I had like a whole, that's probably a better example if I get rid of this segment and I have a whole. So say I want to join these two together, then I can select one from the other and then say make segment, and then it'll like refuse them back together, and then the subdivide and stuff like that works again. So that's a bunch of different options for controlling these points. So otherwise you would just control them like you would with standard modeling. And now I will quickly go through a few examples on things you can build with curves. So let's just disable all that. I will make a little flower out of curves. So I'm going to start with the stem, go to 3, add a little bit, nope, not that. My bevel option was hidden. It's usually not hidden. Do my curve, let's give it a nice little band. So it'll be like one, I'll just probably do a single flower. Something like that. That's cute. And then I'm going to grab these guys. And I'm going to break this apart. I just wanted that there to have. And I can go by normal a little bit. Yep, it does work. Just shrink that down. Okay, so I'm going to show another technique real quick. If I have I'm going to create this. Now I'll make another curve. And I want to make sure the origin, the 3D cursor, is going to match this object, and you'll see why in a moment. In this case, I'm going to use extrude, and I don't want to extrude straight up and down, so I'm just going to tilt it 90 degrees to flatten it. And I don't need that many control points, and I need to control from here. Let's just do that. Something like that, probably. And then I'm going to, remember how I was saying modifiers work on curves, so I'm going to use an array. Make this a factor of 0 because I don't want it to offset locally. I only want it to offset in a rotation. So object offset, select my thingy. The reason why the scale went wonk was because I scaled in object mode earlier, which I technically shouldn't have done. I forgot, but that's okay. We can just scale this down, scale that down. It's the same deal. Honestly, maybe even a little smaller. Okay, and now that we have that, I'm going to just make a few iterations. Whoop. Interesting. Okay, so there's, oh yeah, okay, I guess I just need to apply. There we go. Okay, just make sure that on the geometry you apply your scale. On the null you wouldn't because that'll break it, but if you're having funny issues, I will explain this a little bit more in a different video because there's a bit more to it, but okay. So to control the rotation, I can do this with the object, so probably around there. And then as long as I move these together, that'll be fine. And this is actually pretty huge. Let's make that a lot smaller. And now I will make the little petals. So for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the resolution to 0, and I'm going to change the depth, and I'm going to make it half And I'm going to scale in the half direction that is active by 0.5, so I flatten it. Now I'm applying an object level transform to the curve, so as it rotates, you might see that a little bit. It depends, and I also just want to make this overall tinier, and I don't need that pivot anymore. And the reason for that is so that I get like that curvature, so it kind of looks more like a petal or a stem, you know? Just make sure you see what you're doing from the other views, and we'll add one more down here. Why not? And there we go. We have, just for fun, let's tilt this a little more in that direction. Okay. Yeah, so we have a little flower made entirely out of curves. From this point, what I would probably do is take this and duplicate it, put it into an archive or a build collection, just so I have those live curves. And if the proportions are kind of funny, I would definitely probably make this flower and stuff a little bigger, and add more volume and stuff to it. But hypothetically, let's say that you're like, yes, this is good flower. I like this flower. Even from here, you can convert to mesh. Now it's geometry. Do the same thing here. Convert to mesh. And then you can continue on with your cleanup. So you can start to add your holding edges and like maybe pull this back a little bit, you know, whatever it is that you want to do. So that gives you like a really nice starting point. And of course, those points are still editable, easy to go back to, easy to add extra to. So there's an example of how you can use curves to build vegetation, which is fantastic. And even from here, for example, too, like you can take it even further, right? You can add like solidify, keeping in mind you can still add that stuff to these curves, and you know, offset them more, etc. If you rotate it slightly, you know, do stuff like that. So it's like you can get pretty far with leaving stuff live and without having to collapse stuff down. So you can get quite close to your goal of like what you want your final object to be before you even start committing things. So it's quite versatile in that way. So that's for flower, and then we'll do one more if I was blocking out a human. So typically, actually, we'll start with the head because I like to start with the head. So normally, honestly, the way I start a lot of characters is I just subdivide, mesh, and that's a good starting point for like most heads. Let's just make this more face-like. Change the fall-off mode. Okay, there. We have human face shape. And then let's make a body for him, or whatever, generic human number 5. Some depth. I tend to, with my characters, I tend to like just break that off for the neck because it's just a lot easier, generally speaking. And then if I apply a transform in one object mode, I can get kind of more flattened proportions, which it only gets you so far, you know, but it's definitely helpful. And then I'm going to break this off and zero out my scale. So I just zeroed all those transforms I just did because I would rather scale because I don't want the arm to be like kind of flattened. So we'll just do that. I also want the fall off to be a little different because then it's a little bit easier to build that elbow in. Do something like that. And then I tend to, the one area where curves isn't great at replicating humans is just like the shoulder area. So I tend to just kind of try to imagine what that would look like in between my curve points. It's pretty easy to build with geometry once the curves are applied, but you know. Even the hand is like something I can build out if I want. This is another good time to, if I go to geometry, this is another good one to flatten out. Do this, and then want to break this off, and again, 0 at that scale because I don't want to apply that to the fingers. And this is definitely a good time for like a low order U, so I can get a thumb shape. And if you scale on 0, you'll just basically, you're only scaling the points, not the curve radius, so you can snap your points back together. And he's gonna have a, whoopsie, not that, he's gonna have a cartoony hand. So there, and then you can always location, rotation, rotation? Interesting. Fair enough. All right, that's fine. If one of them is popping, there's another way around it. Okay, so you can put a mirror on interesting. Okay, there we go. One thing I'll do if I just want to visually see it on the other side, but I still want it to be live, is I'll duplicate it, I'll convert it to mesh, and then I'll just scale it negatively. Then I can see it, and if I have to make change, obviously they're not connected anymore, but if I have to make changes, then I can just update it again. So that's something I'll do a lot. Let's make these leggies. little stick leggies. Not that way. Works less good, obviously, for the feet, but honestly, I tend to just box model feet anyway. That was just more for the, so you could see proportions and kind of test stuff out. But yeah, there we go. Now we have a human made out of curves. Could keep finagling these curves, get them into the spot that we like. Maybe this was scaled too much, or maybe I want to change his posture a little bit. Maybe I got to bring his like chest more forward. Maybe I, maybe I made his legs too far back or something. We could like pull this one forward a little bit, and then may even want to like maybe scale this part a little bit. But like once you've noodled with it and you like the shapes and proportions and stuff that you've selected, then you can just one by one convert these pieces to geometry. Like for example, once I have the head good and I know like how many loops I want to go into the neck, then you can just boom boom, make less, make more, make less. It's very editable. For bodies, I tend to like go definitely a little bit higher. Just so you can make sure you get enough resolution down the middle, just because the core, like the base curve resolution for torsos is generally like a little low. Arms and legs are usually a lot better because it gives you 4, which is I think 10 or 12, which is not too bad. So, but yeah, depending on what you're making, pretty easy to block most things out, especially characters and vegetation are very good for that kind of thing. And that is Curves in Blender, and hope y'all liked the tutorial. Like and subscribe if you want to see more, and see you later, folks.